Welcome to UX risk logging and post analysis. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'll jump straight in because I know we're a bit late starting. So risk logging and post analysis sound very boring, obviously, but they are actually incredibly powerful for increasing UX maturity and your personal reputation as a problem solver within and for the business. This is one of the most important strategic tools in the UX toolbox, sadly. It either solves problems or it demonstrates that pain could have been avoided, all whilst improving the project process and building a library of risks and consequences. Most UXers don't log risks. They tend to assume that the project RAID log, if you're on projects that actually have those, will capture everything, but no one else captures predicted risks as well as normal risks holistically like UX can, and that is a huge value and a unique selling point for modern UX. RAID logs are notoriously unreliable and incomplete. So very briefly, for those of you who don't know, my name is Sean McSharry. 50% of my time is focused on live project work, UX strategy, UX awareness initiatives, UX training and standardization, and the other 50% is spent telling people that UX is not UI. I'm sure a lot of you can relate to that. I work with the neurodiverse community a lot, specifically the autistic community. They're amazing natural UXers and problem solvers. Everyone should own one. Joking, I am one. So hopefully you're all familiar with the project lifecycle and UX part in it. Even if you're not allowed to work like this due to low UX maturity in your own organizations or something, but most projects follow this basic process, right? Discovery, alpha, beta, live, or what we look at it from the point of view of UX is discovery, functional architecture, or UX design, and then build, coding, agile, and then live. Today, we're going to be looking at UX risk logs, obviously, and as you can see, we monitor and record risks all the way through the project. We try to head them off or remediate them as we go, of course, but even if we can't, that's not the end of the learning and improvement process. There's a UX-driven continual improvement cycle called post-analysis. We analyze the UX risk log, basically, and pull out the insights. Positive post-live, hopefully not post-mortem, much like the cross between interview thematic insights and service design blueprinting in many respects. For those of you who've done that, I'm going to go through the purpose, value, target audience, data logged, examples, etc. I'll give you a quick mention and overview of what post-analysis does, and then we'll get through to Q&As. So the purpose of risk logging. The risk log is designed to record quantitative and qualitative information on all incidents that potentially or actually negatively impact any aspect of the project's delivery or efficacy, including our UX work. These are recorded as they happen. I can't emphasize that statement enough. I have to say this to my team all the time. Have you put it in the risk log? They can then be mitigated as soon as possible before they do damage, or if they're not mitigated, they can be dissected later in a post-analysis of the project to uncover why they weren't mitigated and reveal useful insights and learnings for future projects as their anecdotal, consistent and predictable impacts become clear. And many of them you'll have already seen in your projects and you'll have gone, why do they keep doing this? This is a way of recording them and leveraging that information. And this is all added to a UX risk library. I won't cover the risk library tonight, but essentially it works much like a research library, where as risks are seen, mitigated or not, and consequences are experienced, those are added to a library and we can build up a profile of what are common risks, common solutions, but I'll mention that as we go. The risk log is also useful for negating the worst effects of any post-project blame storming or finger pointing exercises by the project team or the client as a project draws to a close. There's nothing as good for covering your ass as a log set of risks and remediations assigned to an owner. And I want to say this again, do not procrastinate or hesitate to add a risk to the risk log. So the value of a risk log. Obviously, it makes the project more successful, the user more satisfied, and the business more money. Everyone does less work and the client's happy with the outcomes. I mean, that's obvious if you avoid risks. But Many common mistakes, assumption, and compromises made with good intentions or simply for the sake of hitting some very poor KPIs lead to bad outcomes. You'll see this with things like with development team trying to deliver a certain number of features in a sprint. That's an arbitrary measure of success and leads to risks because corners are cut. These often go unchallenged and unmitigated as organizations go from one failure to the next with no loss of enthusiasm, as Churchill apparently defined success. They repeat the same mistakes without ever learning from them, holistically examining them or correlating the negative or positive sometimes consequences of their actions. Failure, frustration, demotivation, mediocrity, and a growth in the blame culture are what follows. This can be remediated with consistent UX risk logging. It leads to a positive change in the project process and work culture, an increase in residual project knowledge, and a critical change in focus from blame in retrospect mindset to a responsibility in advance mindset. Project team members become more aware of the consequences of the actions of their discipline by repeatedly examining them and their subsequent outcomes from project to project, and are thus educated in the cost of repeating them. The risk log makes your predictions and warnings more tangible, gives tacit credibility to the leadership of your expertise in project success and failure as a UXer. It shows your insights, and even if your remediation recommendations aren't implemented, they can be seen in retrospect to have been the right choices, the right warnings, and the right remediation advice, building trust in the UX team strategically as well as tactically. A common library of risks and remediations. Sorry, did that go ahead too? It did, didn't it? A common library of risk and remediation start to build up from the project to project. Awareness of these risks becomes commonplace across projects and teams, reducing the likelihood of them arising again and acting as a reliable reference if they do. This should be evidenced over time by the project risk logs becoming much smaller from project to project as common risks are avoided in the future due to common learnings from the risk library. Examined and shared by the wider UX team, this library and its insights become a valuable learning tool for good and bad project processes and decisions. It preempts the UXer to respond quicker with greater conviction, credible proof of risk, reliable remediations, and predictable consequences across all projects. It increases not only the expertise of the UX team, but also the UX maturity level within the organization and the likely success of any projects they're involved in. It helps negate that most common of UXer frustrations. Why? Why won't they listen to me or believe my research? It allows us to change the project and cultural narrative slowly from speed, cost, and blame to efficacy, consideration, and prevention. And as I mentioned before, from a blame in retrospect mindset to a responsibility in advance one. And once again, UX provides a single source of truth for risks and consequences, remediation and savings this time. Target audience is fairly straightforward. UX team, risk logging allows the UX team to gather, share, and compare risks, consequences, and remediations on a project by project basis. It builds into a library of risk and remediations for use across all projects. The project teams, risk logging informs them of risks impacting their project work and gives remediation suggestions so they don't end up in the poop and looking bad in the end through no fault of their own. And this builds trust, maturity, and advocacy again back into UX. Project leaders and decision makers, people like product owners, scrum masters, etc. Risk logging highlights risks in real time for them. It suggests remediations as soon as possible, saving time, cost, and pain later that they want avoided. It makes them look good by removing failure points that they would otherwise have to carry the blame for. It helps them make the best decisions by avoiding bad decisions, and it encourages them to fix the bad decisions of others. Business leaders, well, risk logging creates an example-led library of project risks, consequences, and workable remediation responses. It demonstrates our awareness of costs, savings, risk management, and business. It builds trust in the business focus, efficacy, and value of the UX discipline at the highest levels in the organization, at a strategic and tactical level. And finally, client stakeholders. Risk logging manages expectations by clarifying consequences of risks caused by client actions or decisions. It offers a partner and thought leader level remediation and builds trust in our organizations and in the UX discipline. It demonstrates our integrity and our honesty, not by excuses or blaming failures on others, but by spotting risks and defining workable remediations early on. So what sort of insight does a risk log uncover, short and long term, strategically and tactically? Well, it sounds obvious, but any incident that you consider will or might negatively impact any aspect of the project, function, utility, delivery time, cost, etc. You'll start to recognize and catalog comparable patterns of poor decisions or behaviors, assumptions, late delivery, excuses, and their consequences. You'll be able to see those as they're forming going forward before they actually come to fruition and head them off. You'll create or add to a library of common risks, consequences, and known remediation recommendations, proven in fact. Exceptional risks are one-offs, highly impactful, and sometimes insidious. You don't even notice them till it's too late because they're one-offs. But getting ahead of these is literally the difference between success and failure for the project. So as you learn to spot those become the outliers, whereas all the common ones you've learned to see and remediate in advance. And the problem fulcrum. Where the cause of the risk originates is incredibly important. Identifying and addressing the problem cultures, processes, teams, or even individuals enables the organization to compete better and UX to mature more. Time can be spent addressing these root causes, not the symptoms. And this avoids many additional risks, some of which may not even have manifested yet and now never will. This is a huge strategic win for organizations. So let's talk about an example UX risk log, because this is what you really want to see. So there are 7 columns in a standard risk log, a UX risk log. And it's in a table that has a title, obviously, so you know what project it is. So in this case, we have a personal banking solution. And I should tell you, this comes from a real project. Obviously, I've changed the names and the titles to protect the guilty, frankly. We have a date, the date you recognize the risk, and thus the date you added it, right? Because we don't procrastinate. The minute you see a risk or suspect a risk, you put it in there. I know I repeat this, but probably the single most important thing about a risk log. No one should have to say to you, have you put it in the risk log? As soon as you see it and you think, well, that's a problem, or that could be a problem, you put it in the risk log. Even if later it turns out to be nothing, that's fine. You can always delete it. You cannot add it properly later. So in this case, the junior PO ignored the user research. This is the title, right? The risk title. Now, it's a simple title that makes it obvious what the risk incident was. No in-depth details are required here, just a unique title for the risk incident. In this example, or this actual example, I made this title deliberately too vague. It's important it's concise, but there could be 20 risk entries with this same title. It's useful thematically. We know that the junior PO ignored research, but what's really important is what specific research he ignored, and that's not stated here. And I wanted to make this point by making it simpler than possible. So the old Einstein saying, make it as simple as possible, but not simpler, is really important here. You should be able to identify the specific risk from its title, but no more. So this should have said what research the junior PO ignored. The next column is description. So data on the incident, not the insight or solution. Do not write any conclusions or potential impacts here, just the risk incident details. What happened? It's very, very easy to fall into the trap of including more than just the data about this risk and find yourself writing the impacts, conclusions, and even remediations and responsible owners. This is probably the thing I have to mentor my team on more than anything else when they're writing risk logs. Description is just the facts of what happened, just the facts, ma'am, not what the impacts were, not the remediation, how to fix it, not who owns it, nothing, just what happened. And that can be quite hard for people to cut off at. In this example, the junior PO on the project instructed the developers to completely remove the support CTAs, the call to actions, the buttons and links, as a method of reducing the number of help desk calls. User complaints and help desk calls are already too high, and it is a project goal to reduce them. We are not remaining cognizant of the reasons for the current levels of support requests, nor the commercial consequences of hiding support CTAs, buttons, links, etc. This actually happened. The next column is the negative impacts. What does that risk cause in terms of negative impacts? You don't have to have proof at this point. You have to have suspicions at most. And this is the impact you believe will be experienced if this risk goes unresolved. In as far as possible, this should be quantitative as well as qualitative. This will allow you to measure the risk and response efficacy retrospectively, whilst simultaneously improving their efficacy for future projects and building up a trustworthy library of project risk and remediations for everyone. This will also allow you to get better at predicting and resolving issues in advance. When presented to the decision maker on the project, so the owner, it should be as clear and compelling as possible. Focus on loss aversion first, and then positive impacts for the project and for them of avoiding these issues. In this case, the negative impacts that I highlighted were: superficially, help desk calls will drop dramatically, but this is a dishonest way of achieving this. It will prevent the users from getting support when they need it. Research shows the users are not fooled, and this will negatively impact brand and revenue. There will be an increase of negative reviews of the bank on social media and comparison platforms. Existing customers will become disenfranchised and move their money to competitor banks who have easy support and less need for support in the first case. This is terrible user experience and customer service. And though you will no longer know, they will tell other people, we will experience negative advocacy and no lessons will be learned, so banking services will not improve. This will reduce profit. Spell it out in such a way that it can be read, reviewed, and measured easily later. As mind-numbingly obvious as this risk is, I did the research with users, so it wasn't my word against the POs. Exactly the excuse he would have used and actually did use, or did try to. The next column, of course, the remediation. We've given a description of the problem. We've said what negative impacts it is, but negative impacts are simply doom mongering in the eyes of the business and offer no measurable value. They tend to see them as complaining and nitpicking, not being a member of the team, not constructive or helpful. And that's certainly how they'll excuse them, ignore them, or sweep them under the carpet if you don't also have a recommended solution, a remediation. In this case, I said, research and address the core reasons we already have so many customer complaints and support calls at the moment. Provide quick and easy access to responsive and helpful support so that lessons are learned, customers are happy, and the service can focus on improving the most impactful issues that the customer raises, obviously, thus reducing the need for support calls instead of simply hiding them. I went on to suggest that they make the support CTA visible on every page, and that the junior PO's role should be changed to junior toilet cleaner, and the staff should be fed nothing but hot curry until he stops gaming the system and does his job with integrity and with the customer's best interest in mind. The remediation should contain specific actions. The putting him into the role of a janitor aside, the specific actions are important. Even if they seem really simple and obvious, you can't prove remediation without specific remediation tasks to tick off. And if you allow others to interpret the remediation by making that remediation too vague, they'll either argue ad nauseum about what they are, or they'll cut corners, or they'll game the solution, or they'll apply minimum effort, or God help us, we'll get groupthink where nobody really agrees or the loudest voice wins. So it's all very well to have a description, highlight the negative impacts, make suggestions for remediation, but somebody has to own that. And it's not just owning it. Somebody has to have the power to enact that remediation. And this is where the risk owner is. The risk owner is the person who has the power to act on the remediation recommendations. You have to identify them. It could be the PO, the client stakeholder, it could be anyone. And it isn't always the same person. It depends on the nature of the problem. They're not necessarily the cause of the risks, though sometimes they are. Bring risks to the attention of the owner as soon as you've logged them in the risk log and can offer remediation advice. Do not wait. And again, do not wait to add them. Do not wait to advise the owner. Discuss the entry and encourage them to act on your advice immediately. In this case, again, name protected to defend the guilty. Dermot Hanley, which wasn't even vaguely his name. Once you've identified them and you've gone through and discussed these elements, here's the description of the problem, here's the negative impact, here's what we suggest you do to fix that. Dermot Hanley can do or not do whatever he likes. He's in charge. He's the product owner, or he's certainly the risk owner. But whatever happens, we will fill in the final column, actions and outcomes. This lists what anyone did as a result of discovering the risk or having it pointed out to them. Anyone, what anybody did, you, me, the risk owner, any other member of the team who acted upon this risk. All the steps are taken in response and the dates they're done. You'll need to show you took as much action as was possible and at least raise the risk to the identified risk owner as soon as possible. That's the minimum action that should be in there, that you brought this to the attention of the risk owner. And this column will grow as actions and outcomes evolve in response to the risk, hopefully. And for this, I said, my entries were, I challenged the junior PO and the developers on the value and morality of this action. He dismissed this, saying he delivered many successful projects like this before, and it was just my opinion versus his. In return, I carried out user interviews with 20 existing customers on how important it was to be able to contact the help desk. 20 out of 20 said it was critical and already hard enough. It needs to be made easier. This should have been compelling. This should have been overwhelming for the project team and the PO, and they should have just gone, all right, okay, I'm doing the wrong thing. But the junior PO said that the users were wrong and continued to instruct the devs to remove all support links. I have escalated this to the senior PO and the project stakeholder. They have agreed to speak with the junior, but not to move him to janitorial services. I still think this is the best solution. In this case, the risks weren't remediated. And when the consequences were very tangibly experienced and very senior stakeholders asked why, I was able to show them this risk entry, amongst others. Before they could speak to the junior PO, who was highly implicated in this, he explored new opportunities elsewhere. This wasn't the ideal outcome, obviously, as the users still suffered, but the risk log provided a method of autopsy to recognize and prevent future similar failures. It gave broad learnings to the organization and increased the trust in and thus the maturity of UX in the organization. It gave us visibility at a very high level. It showed that we were the business conscience. And it made them realize that we don't just deal with digital problems or process problems. We deal with process individuals if necessary. Wherever the problems lie, we can highlight them and fix them. And in fact, this is what happened. So some final thoughts. You have to always enter the risks as soon as you see or suspect them. I'm going to keep saying this. It's really important. The risk log should be created on day one of the project, your first interaction with the project, even if that's pre-sales meeting. It will allow you to show the business acumen that they don't know you have and the value you have to the organization. It makes you a credible resource for risk identification, remediation, and learning. And why wouldn't it? You are literally on the front line uncovering things. As always, consistency, detail, and evaluation are critical if the risk log is to be of real value to you, the project, and the business, financially, culturally, and strategically. Even if your remediation recommendations are accepted and actioned, the entry should persist in the risk log and be noted as remediated in the actions column, because successful remediations are also really important. They act, they head something off, it gets done, we know it's possible to convince them to do it. It's still a reference point example and an opportunity to learn for everyone in the project or the UX team. It shows a valuable business use of UX. Appreciate that the more risk logs and incidents that you record and address project by project, the better you'll get at identifying and remediating risks quickly and competently. You'll also grow in confidence and conviction, and your risk library data will become compelling. And not just for you, for other UXers too. It acts, as I say, very much like a research repository. As risks unfold, be sure to return to the risk log and add developments to the individual risks. This is critical if post-analysis is to work. You're to build a reliable library of evidence-based case studies, and if UX is to mature in your organization. And that brings us nicely on to, what do I do with all this information? Well, the risk log directly feeds the post-analysis document at the end of the project. This is one of the most important and illuminating post-project documents produced by any project team. It will help the organization and the whole team when analyzed. One of the reasons post-mortems are so rare and so poor is that people don't take note of the risks, the impacts, and the actions at the time they happen. So going back over them later is much more difficult and time-consuming. People disagree on what happened and who's responsible because they all recall it differently. This is part convenience, part poor memory, part confirmation bias. As a result, different people may remember events differently depending on their biases, memory, or perspectives. It's not very efficient. And you learn nothing as a result, except, to have a lot of people pointing fingers at other people saying it wasn't me, it was them. Presenting the risks that were impactful, highlighting the cost and showing how they could have been fixed if they'd listened to UX is one of the tasks that will ultimately give UX a seat on the board. It is a strategic, global, business level service with serious long-term value. And it is quite straightforward to do on any project because you're not absolutely proving it. You're recording it, and at the end, you're looking back to see if those caused problems, if they weren't remediated. And that's a fairly straightforward thing to do. The key is understanding what goes into each of those columns carefully, cleanly, and absolutely locking a risk every single time one happens, exactly when it happens. Do not wait. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening to me rant on about a very exciting, I did tell you it was going to be a sexy topic,